Mercedes-AMG Interview Lounge.
And we welcome back Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Good morning, afternoon, or whatever we are.
Well, I can't believe you're back. Wasn't it enough pain coming last time? You came back for more torture.
Yes.
Did you miss us? Is that what it was?
Oh, every morning I woke up and I said, I must come back to New York. And the only thing I must do when I get there is to come on the Elvis Duran show. And people would say back at home, the guy's mad.
It is.
But I enjoyed it last time. Thank you very much. It was good fun.
I will tell you, the response from that show was massive. So the fact that you agreed to come back and talk about new projects it's an honor to have you back.
That's why they stopped me at immigration, is it?
Yes, it is. Don't you love flying across the pond? Do you enjoy coming to the States?
Yeah, I love it, And I mean, the great thing is, New York is really the home of musicals, and it's in a great shape at the moment. I think Broadway's in a fantastic time. I mean, there are so many good shows to see, and there are so many good new shows.
I just saw Frozen the other night.
Yeah, so did I. Now, that's really, really good. Well staged.
And
staged.
What I was surprised about was that there's a lot of adult humor in it.
There
really
is. It is. And it looks absolutely gorgeous.
It does.
I mean, beautifully designed.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead. What other shows have you seen?
Well, the show you see I saw it quite a little while ago now, is The Band's Visit. I mean, that much appeals to me because it's a subject that, if you think about it, and you imagine going into a producer and saying, I got this idea for a musical. It's about an Egyptian military band who are booked to appear in Tel Aviv, turn up at the airport and there's nobody to meet them, and they wander around Tel Aviv, and it's the story of what happens to them. And you could see a producer saying, yes, thank you very much, we'll let you know. I mean, but like all great musicals, it's based on an idea that sounds, on paper, undoable.
Well,
but it's brilliant.
Most of them all sound undoable. Let's talk about Cats. Cats, by the way, I mean, one of the hugest shows of all time, almost didn't get made. Because people thought it was just the weirdest idea.
Yes, exactly. I mean, time and time again, people said, you're crazy to do this, and forget it, stop it. And, it was really against the odds. It opened literally with a second mortgage on my house.
Wow.
Because there was nobody else involved who had a hit in musicals really before. And it was only me. And so I had to kind of carry all the financial side of it. And it was really hairy, really, really hairy. We really need, I'm not making a pun because it's about cats, but it was extremely furry,
it was very
I should
furry,
say.
Yes. But instead, the musical purred along.
But it didn't quite. I mean, it very, very, very nearly didn't get on, even down to the last minute. You see, it's a really strange story. About what happened, because we went into a theatre that had not been used as a theatre for quite a long time and had been turned into a TV studio. But it was the perfect theatre for us for a number of reasons, because it was able to be a theatre almost in the round, and we wanted to do Cats as theatre in the round originally. And when we found the theatre, we really wanted to go in there. But the guys who owned it said, look, we've had flop after flop in here. We've got a really, really good business going as a TV studios. If you run with this show for a couple of years, we're never going to get this business going again. So they put a penalty on us, which was most unusual.
They were betting against you.
Yeah. They said that if the show only ran like 6 weeks, which is what I think they thought they would, fine, there'd be no penalty at all. But if the show then ran for a year or 2 years, then that would really destroy their TV business. And because everybody would say, well, it's no longer a TV studio, we'll go somewhere else. Wow. So they had me with what in those days would be equivalent to about a sort of $2 or $3 million penalty that would have to be paid to the theatre owners if Cats actually ran a year.
So, I mean, it was probably the riskiest business decision you've ever made.
Oh, it was a nightmare.
Well, did you ever pay off your house mortgage?
Well, I mean, we did. And then, of course, I mean, it was all fine, but it could have been one of the biggest moments of bathos in theatrical history when somebody dressed as a cat ran on that stage.
Right.
Yeah. And it was every single thing was against it. I mean, the theatre itself had been a graveyard. Even Grease, starring Richard Gere, had failed in there. I mean, you have to think of that. And it was me working for the first time away, really, from Tim Rice. The only thing I'd done before that had been a failure, which was a show called Jeeves, which didn't work. I was working with the poems of a dead poet, T.S. Eliot, an American poet, but he wasn't exactly around, and people were saying, what's he doing setting poetry? It's about cats. And they're going to ask that these cats, human beings dressed as cats, are going to dance. And everybody thought in Britain at the time that we all had 2 left feet when it came to dance. It was never thought that we could do a dance musical. So everybody said, well, that's a no-go zone. Our producer, Cameron Mackintosh, was in those days, he hadn't had a big hit before. He hadn't really had a hit at all before. So he was an unknown bet. The director was Trevor Nunn from the Royal Shakespeare Company. What's the guy who runs the Royal Shakespeare Company doing the work of a dead poet set about cats? I mean, people thought, but he doesn't know anything about musicals, that's that. So you add up all those ingredients, and everybody thought that the biggest recipe for disaster in the history of London's West End was about to unleash.
But wait, let me ask you a question then. By the way, Andrew Lloyd Webber is about to answer this question. The same question you're thinking of asking yourself. Why did you do it? What is it about you that said, you know what? Everyone's betting against it. There's something in this I believe is going to be
I don't know.
Excellent.
I think it's sort of blind faith, really. I mean, I thought we had something very special.
Okay.
I thought we were doing something that in its day had never really been done before. And it was a huge adventure. And, you know, what happens is that when you're on a boat that everybody thinks is going to sink, everybody really pulls together. And it was an extraordinary time. And it was, there's nothing one could say. I mean, all I do remember distinctly was backstage with Cameron Mackintosh, with our kids waiting to go on stage and our young cast. And we were all saying, what are we doing here? And I remember standing with Cameron and waiting for the moment where the first cat ran out, waiting for the howls of laughter. And instead there was silence. And we thought, this is extraordinary. And then the first number happened, and there was a huge round of applause where there isn't supposed to be a round of applause because it's supposed to take you into the cat world. And we went tiptoed round to the front of the house, and the audience was loving it.
I must assume that every single production you do has that thought, this is going to fail.
Not like that one.
Okay, and look at that. And by the way, is this one of the many stories that's in your new book, Unmasked?
So there are a few stories in there. And of course, what happened then was that everybody you could think of wanted to come to Cats. So there are a few stories about the people who came to Cats.
So I don't have to buy the book now. He just told
Just tell us.
Yeah.
But no, there's 500 pages in Unmasked.
A few more, I'm afraid.
So I'm sure you have a lot more stories that I'm dying to hear. But I now that we know you, I can read it in your voice, which makes all the difference in the world. I believe.
You know, I think it does. I mean, I wrote the book myself. I didn't want anybody else touching it. And I like to think that if you did know me, that you'd find that it's quite fun.
Aren't you happy you did it, though?
I am, yeah. I'm pleased I did it.
Are you tired of yourself at this point?
But I am so bored with myself.
Are you sick
I
of
say in the introduction that I'm the most boring person I've ever written about, and I stand by it.
Oh, stop. I don't. And you wrote it all on an iPad, which I find very interesting.
Yes, it is interesting. But you see, I can't do technology.
Well, iPad is technology.
Is it?
You did a great job.
Well, yeah, I mean, vaguely. I couldn't have done it without my lovely PA, Jan, who's standing over there somewhere. So I got to say, hi, Jan.
She takes all the
credit. She had to decipher it.
It's all Jan.
iPad. But I'm a vinyl man, you see. I go right back to the days of vinyl. And I don't own a mobile phone.
You don't?
You don't?
No.
So how do people get in contact
That's
with
the point.
you?
They can't.
Oh. I like that idea.
It's brilliant.
How can
It's
I send you
absolutely
dirty
brilliant.
pictures? I've got dirty
You
pictures to send
can't.
you.
You can't. There's nothing you can do.
So
I'll just show it to you live.
Do you,
No, you can put that one away.
do you have a landline at home? Like, do you have a phone in your home?
I have a landline, yes.
Electricity. Do you have
Yes.
electricity at the house?
Well, only when the generator works.
Okay.
Wow.
Well, do you feel like if you do cross that threshold and you start to immerse into technology, it'll change your life so or you don't want to go down that road? Is there something you're...
Look, let me tell you, all of the albums I certainly made and all the ones I remember all sound better on vinyl.
They do.
And you can go into the technical reasons why, and the why digital doesn't sound so good on CD and all of that. And you can talk about sampling rates and all that kind of thing. But the fact of the matter is that I am ahead of the curve and have always been by keeping my vinyl collection. And everything sounds better on vinyl, in my view.
One of the first albums I remember listening to a long time ago when I really understood how to put an album on a turntable was Jesus Christ Superstar.
Well, that too sounds really... The trouble is when they remaster a lot of these things for CD or for whatever and for downloads and everything now, they compress them all. And so the actual sound quality, I've got an album coming out now, which is sort of for my 70th birthday. And I was sent all the album and I said, no, this doesn't sound right. And we went back and we looked at a lot of the tracks. And at some point they've been remastered. And of course they've been remastered by an engineer who, he's probably did them in a great batch. And they're not as good as the original ones. So I'm rather pleased with this new album because it's actually remastered by me. And therefore it's got all the tracks sounding as I originally intended them.
Well, hand me that. This is available too. Okay, so we're talking about two things I'm dying for you to pick up. First of all, Andrew Lloyd Webber's Unmasked, a memoir. And this, Andrew Lloyd Webber Unmasked, the Platinum Collection, the ultimate greatest hits, according to you.
Well, was a selection put together, frankly, by the record company, and right. I agreed with it. I thought it was rather good. They also suggested some new tracks, and so there are some quite interesting new versions of old songs.
You know what I love is Lana Del Rey.
Well, Lana did a lovely recording of "You Must Love Me," which was from Evita.
Evita,
which was the new song written for Evita.
Isn't that awesome when you have artists today that are just so turned on by your work, they're dying to get into a studio and sing it for you because they do it for you. They want your approval. You know that.
Yeah, it was extraordinary, really, because when I was at the Grammys a couple of weeks ago, I mean, so many of the artists there who I think are absolutely right there today and brilliant, they also come up and say, I was the narrator in Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat.
Wow.
It's extraordinary, but Lana, I think, has done a beautiful job with it, and I've always been a great admirer of hers. And it's just interesting to me to hear new interpretations of songs that I wrote a while ago.
Watching the Oscars the other day, my friends Benj Pasek and Justin Paul, who, as you know, wrote the music for Dear Evan Hansen, and they had a song from Greatest Showman. And even though they did not win the Oscar, it was the performance of the night.
Yeah, it was the theatrical performance of the night. And they are wonderful new theatre composers. I think it's incredibly exciting. As I was saying earlier, that Broadway, in my opinion, is really thriving. And what's great about it is that the new generation of writers are really writing, I think, from a background which is far more about rock and pop and its history. And I mean, Lin-Manuel Miranda, I admire his work enormously, but in actual fact, his background is very much more, I would say, the popular musical theatre and very much more the pop culture than, say, some composers in the past. I always felt some while ago that I was a little bit sort of a fish out of water sometimes because I never ever saw any difference between rock and theatre, ever. And none of the writers now does it even cross their mind that there's a difference. But when I started out, people did think there was a difference. But I was very lucky. When I was a kid, when I was about 8 years old, 9 years old, in Britain, there was a program that used to come out on Saturday nights, which was a live TV program. It was called Oh Boy. I don't think it actually ran on British TV for that long, but it was set in an old theatre, and all the top British rock acts of the day would sing on that program. The whole thing was, though, that it was staged. And up to that time, you saw pop or rock or something, but there was no attempt ever to stage it. But so it would look crude now, but you'd say you get a singer like Cliff Richard or somebody who was very big in Britain at the time. But behind him would suddenly come the backing singers, and the camera would swoop over this old variety theatre, and you'd see the fans, and you'd see the old theatre. And so to me, when I was 8 years old, 9 years old, I had all of the American musicals that I loved, and I was lucky enough to see, say, My Fair Lady and West Side Story in round about the same time, over one kind of Christmas holidays. But at the same time, I was watching this TV show, which was set in a theatre, and it was pop music. So it never occurred to me at all that there was any difference between what was going on within pop and rock and theatre.
Music is music. Theatre is music.
Exactly. But I think coming back to Pasek and Paul, I mean that they come from a world where it's natural to be following the charts.
Well, I'm going to talk about them and as it relates to you and the book. For instance, Stacey Menget, who is a big producer for Evan Hansen, she talked about when she first met them, she gave them money to buy a piano so they could afford to have a piano between them to start working on their music. It was lean times. Is that where we go with you in your book, Unmasked? I would love to know what it was like for you when you started out, before you had the extravagance of being able to afford to bring in anyone you wanted to help you or to stage things. When it was just you and a writing partner, do you miss those days and how you could create then versus now when you have the world at your fingertips?
Well, kind of when I started out, my family was, how can I put it? It was a very musical family, but a rather bohemian one.
Right.
I mean, we lived in my grandmother's flat because my father, although he was the director of the London College of Music, he came from a very working class background and he didn't have any money. And my mum was a piano teacher. And frankly, they couldn't have afforded to have set up home on their own. So they lived in Granny's flat. Mm-hmm. And we all lived there. And there was music around me all the time. So I can't say there wasn't a piano. But it was a kind of weird environment in one sense because it had my brother who took up the cello very early on. And we very, very much, were living from, more or less day to day in many ways. But it was a kind of very exciting environment because my dad, although he was a classical musician, he did love music of all sorts. And I think he was a composer himself, but he didn't really publish that much because I think he felt his music was slightly out of its time. And I think it probably was. But he allowed me to bring any kind of music in. And so we used to have all kinds of music in the house going on at any one time.
But look at the difference between your creative process when you were in those days versus today. I mean, obviously...
Well, I was sort of 8 then.
Well, you were 8, of course.
But my creative process then was I built myself a little toy theatre because I loved theatre so much. And I used to do little productions of god-awful ideas for musicals, and it was bored parents, friends were made to come round and listen as I sort of pushed toy soldiers around and sang and did my tunes, and my brother was enlisted to do them and a few other friends. And I don't know, I had this complete, outside of anything in my family at all, just love of musicals from the word go. And it was also strange in a way because by the time I was in my early teens and I went to a big school, as it were, musicals were off the radar for my generation because the Beatles were just happening and everybody wanted to be a Beatle and Swinging London was happening. And it was just one of those times people thought, this guy is crazy. I mean, he likes musicals. Now, it may sound funny in America, but back in Britain at that time, I mean, musicals were not considered to be anywhere near the mainstream. And indeed, I mean, the kind of chattering class kind of parents who the school I went to, there were quite a lot of kind of opinion makers and all that sort of thing who had their kids at the school. They thought that I was crazy because I'd say I like Rodgers and Hammerstein. People would say, "What? You like Rodgers and Hammerstein? It's all sentimental." And they'd say, "You'll Never Walk Alone," Carousel, and these are great shows by one of the greatest melodists who ever lived. And yet people at those days, they just back in Britain, they thought it was below everything. So when The Sound of Music came to London, you can imagine, I remember going to the first night of that, because I'd written a fan letter to Richard Rodgers when I got this in my book, but I was 13, I guess, and he wrote back to me and said, "Would you like to come to the first night of my show?"
That must have been such a hit.
Which was fantastic.
Across the head for
so
you.
I go to the first night of the show, and I mean, I loved it, it was tune after tune after tune. Next morning when I got to school, some of the boys had laid out some of the reviews for me. And I mean, one of the reviews said, "If you were a diabetic craving extra sickly sweet things, take a load of extra insulin, and you will not fail to thrill to the sound of music."
Oh, man.
My God. And that is the show which we all know, is one of the great popular musicals of all time.
Right.
And what I thought fun, though, because Rodgers must have had, and Hammerstein, they must have had the last laugh, because after this ridiculous line, outside the theatre for the next 7 years was, "You will not fail to thrill to the sound of music." a wonderful example of creative advertising.
Yes,
and my
editing.
first lesson in it.
In filters.
But, I mean, that was what it was. I mean, people thought that The Sound of Music was saccharine sweet slosh.
But do you miss the lean days at all? The days when you were first starting out and just trying to get business going and getting investors?
I kind of do, but it nothing changes. I mean, every time you do a new musical, you always think that you're pushing a new boulder up a hill or whatever. And I'm right now. I'm on the verge of thinking. I think I've got the subject I want to do, and it'll be a very, very different thing for me if I choose to do it.
Tell us everything right now.
I cannot tell you about it. I wish I could.
Give us from the very beginning to the very last note. Go.
Next time, if you ask me back, I will. But
I would love to hear that.
But though, to answer your question, the thing is that I don't know. I get to answer it a different way. I think if you know what you want to do in life, you're very, very lucky. I think if you get to succeed and have a great time in doing what you do, you are so lucky it's not possible. I sort of pinch myself every time, and I just think each new musical is a new adventure with new people, new team, and I just love it so much that in one sense I can't remember it really being any different. I mean, everyone is just as nerve-wracking. You still get just as worried about reviews. You still get just as worried that everything's going to go all right. I mean, do you know what happened when I went to see Frozen the other night, which, as I said, I thought was extraordinary to look at. And I saw Tom Schumacher, the producer, at the interval, and he said, "Oh, God, thank God, Andrew, we got through it technically." And, I know what he means with a show that's really complicated. You sort of think something's going to go wrong. I mean, the one thing about live theatre is, frankly, I never tire of it, and the adrenaline you get when you even if it's an old show and you go and see it again, you start thinking, God, I've got to get to work on this. This isn't quite right, and
right.
whatever, and I need to talk to
it's
the actors.
It's a living, breathing thing.
That's the thing. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but
no, you have. It's still as invigorating to you now as it was then.
Yeah.
So as you sit down and listen to all these cuts, there's 4 CDs. With a total of, oh my gosh, there's a lot of music on this. When you sit down to listen to Andrew Lloyd Webber Unmasked, the Platinum Collection, have you sat down by yourself and listened to it?
That's interesting that you say sit down and listen.
Have you?
Does anybody do that anymore?
I do.
You see, that's great, because when I tried to put the order together of this, I tried to make it quite funny in places, so that, for example, my Pie Jesu from my Requiem Mass is followed by Where Did the Rock Go from School of Rock, which is quite a good question when you hear those two juxtaposed. And I didn't think anybody listened to anything, and I thought they just downloaded tracks and that was that.
No, to listen to a collection.
But you don't have a CD player, do you?
Well, I will find it. No, I'll download it from iTunes. I'll put it on my phone.
Yeah,
that's where
but
I get
you
my
would
music.
listen to it all the way through.
That's what I do. A lot of artists today, Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Take 3,
sir. A lot of artists put songs out by singles. They won't even drop an entire album. I love to listen to a piece of work from beginning to end.
But we love singles too.
Well, without
the
a doubt.
day of the 3-minute pop single was fabulous.
But to listen to a collection, because I know that whoever put these 4 albums together in one big album, there is a method to the madness in the order in which they're here.
There is a serious running order to that.
And I like listening for that.
On the big one, or the 4 CD version.
I love listening for that.
Well, you see if you can work it out.
Well, this is a lot of music. But have you sat in a room by yourself and listened to this thing from beginning to end?
No.
Why not?
Because I haven't had the time. But what I have done, though, is I was there when we mastered it, though. As I was saying, going back to it, it's amazing, how things have changed over the years. And you say Jesus Christ Superstar, say the Superstar single track, which was the first thing that ever came out of it. I mean, that must have been remastered hundreds of times. And, of course, nobody can find now the original tape that it was on.
Right.
That's one of the problems. So you have to kind of go back almost to a pristine vinyl copy of it and take it off that.
See, that's the best.
Yeah, which is what we did.
What do you think about all of the shows that are coming to television, like Jesus Christ Superstar with John Legend?
Well, that's going to be very exciting, I think, because I've seen a bit of it in rehearsal now.
Okay.
And it's very, very much more what I really hoped it would be in the first place. I mean, when it opened on Broadway, I hate to say now, nearly 50 years ago, it was very glitzy. It was not what I would have hoped for at all, and of course I had nothing to do with the production of it in those days. And, I was actually pretty shattered by it. I describe all that in my book. But, here was I, age 23, with my absolute childhood dream impossibly coming true of my first show opening on Broadway, not even in London, Broadway. And there it was, and it was a sort of glitzy kind of dressed up version of what I'd originally intended. The thing about Jesus Christ Superstar is because nobody wanted to produce it in the theatre at all originally, it was recorded first because there was a record company, and there was a guy at the record company who rated the idea, and he gave the money for us to record it first. And so we had to consider it really as a kind of musical radio play, if that makes any sense, because you had to listen to the album at home, follow the story with nothing visual, of course, in front of you. So I think Jesus Christ Superstar works in a way best when it's almost like a staged concert. And the NBC one that's coming up at shortly is very much staged with the band there. It's very highly staged from what I can see, but it's very much with the band in vision, and so it will have a feeling of what I always liked best with Jesus Christ Superstar originally was when it was done in arenas, and it was raw and it was rock, and not glitzed up. From what I can see of this production, it's going to be pretty raw, and I think even the audience may be part of the action in a way that the audience may not quite realise from what I can see.
Excellent.
I'm excited about that. I mean, I genuinely am, because for Superstar to be taken right back to its roots and stripped away is fantastic.
When's it coming out? When is it
It's
out?
Easter Sunday, I think.
Easter Sunday.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah. So let's do it on Easter Sunday. Have you ever listened to a song that you have written in your headphones or in a studio by yourself and said, you really hit it out of the park with that song? That is brilliant. Do you give yourself that personal pat on the back?
Well, of course, also, I don't write lyrics, and so the lyrics have to be really great and right, Yeah, and of course, if you're thinking of a song as a standalone single, as we were talking about, then you've got to think about the production as well. And there are certain songs of mine that I really am very, very, very pleased with, of course.
Would you share those with us?
Well, I mean, look, it's some of the obvious ones. I mean, one that's not so well known here, but was a huge hit in Britain and, funny enough, in the rest of the world, was a song called "No Matter What," which I wrote with Jim Steinman of Meatloaf fame, and I think that's one of the best produced pure pop records, perhaps possibly the best pure pop record that I ever did, and I do like that. I mean, but do you know what? I'm not one of those people who likes really listening back to my old things just for the sake of it. I am somebody who likes to move forward.
Do you love it when people come up and say, your favorite song that you did, you wrote is this?
Yes, and it's when they say songs from Les Miserables that I always get a little worried.
Oh, oops. Yeah, that Les Mis, that's the best musical you ever did.
And then people come up to me and they say, lovely Sarah Brightman. They say, and that Time to Say Goodbye, what a fantastic song. And of course, I had nothing to do with it at all.
Take credit for it. It's okay.
It's easier to say, oh, yes, I absolutely.
Do you have a favorite?
Oh, Phantom is my all-time favorite. And Evita. I loved Evita.
Yes, well, Evita is... That's an interesting one, that one. I've always had mixed feelings about Evita because I'm very pleased with what I did with it. But as I describe in the book, it's really a story about how dangerous it is for extremism to take control, and how a very attractive personality to some, in the form of Eva Peron, how she was able to managed to get to the position she did in a country that was, by Latin American standards, very democratic in those days. And, La Prensa, the newspaper there, was a sort of equivalent to the New York Times in a kind of way. And yet somehow she and her husband, Peron, managed to manipulate the system and use the trade union power to get themselves into basically a right-wing dictatorship. Get themselves into power. So in one sense, it's a sort of cautionary story, and it was very much written, again, something I go into in the book, against the background of what was going on in Britain and to a lesser extent in New York, actually, because New York very nearly went bankrupt, as you know, in the 1970s. But in Britain, I mean, there was quite serious talk about the possibility of revolution. And it was a very scary time. We were on a 3-day week, which meant that, you could only work 3 days a week because there were power cuts. There'd been a all-out strike of miners, and the trades unions had managed to bring down the government, and it was a very, very difficult time. I mean, if you think about it, the stock market in Britain went down from 600 points to 100 points. Well, can you imagine? I mean, i.e., it went down to 20% of its value. If that happened, less than that happened to Wall Street today. Can you imagine what people would be saying? I mean, people would be running around the streets in panic. And it was like that. And I guess that we, perhaps subconsciously, because we didn't intend to write about that, but I think subconsciously we picked the story of Eva Peron for that reason. And it's about how you can see how in certain circumstances people can get their way to power. And that's why I'm a bit ambivalent about it. I think I did a good job with it, but I don't empathize with any of the people in it.
In the course of your day, do you just see something at just a random thing on the street and go, damn it, I should write a musical about that? I mean, writing about the subject matter of Evita is a very obvious story. There's obvious feelings and
Well, I don't know that it was obvious. I mean, nobody in England, for example, had ever heard of Eva Peron.
Well, then why did you decide to be a part
of
that?
Well, it was Tim Rice who really wanted to write it. But I think I can tell you very, very specifically where the idea came from for Tim. He was listening to a series on BBC Radio, which was about 50s icons. And he was listening to the one about James Dean. And at the end of the program, they said, and next week, Eva Peron. And he thought, I never heard of Eva Peron. What's all this about? And I think the only way anybody knew about Eva Peron, who was my generation, was that, if you collected stamps and you collected Argentine stamps, there were lots of stamps with her picture on them.
Right.
And that's about it. Tim tuned into the program and said, I think there's an extraordinary story here. And, it isn't an obvious subject for a musical, frankly. I mean, the story about, a right-wing dictator's wife and a cautionary tale at that is not what you necessarily would think would be a fantastic idea. But it comes back to what I was saying is that the ideas that people kind of think are great ideas for musicals are normally not. And the ideas that, are off the wall are normally the best ones.
So you wonder what my favorite song is? Do you care?
I do care so passionately that I can't wait for you to tell me.
As if we never say goodbye from Sunset Boulevard. One of the best songs ever written, in my opinion.
Well, thank you.
And especially in the context of the story. Now, your favorite...
Well, it was a moment that, as a composer, if you can't make that moment work, you should really give up. Because it's the moment where Norma Desmond comes back into the studio again, and then the old lighting technician sees her and turns the light on her. And I mean, that's the moment when I saw that movie. It was suggested to me, funnily enough, by Hal Prince, and then I never went through it with Hal. But some years later, I remember thinking that's a moment that I have to write for.
Could you write an entire musical around one song? This is a great song right here. Let's write a musical around it. Has that ever happened?
It has been done a few times. Let's not actually name any of them. But
which one?
No, you can't. You can't. I couldn't do that. I mean, you have to start with a great story. And I think I said when I was last on your program that a great story can carry an okay musical score, but a great musical score can't carry a bad story. And one of the things about Sunset Boulevard is it's a fabulous, fabulous movie and it's a fabulous story. School of Rock, great primal tale. Very similar in its construction as a tale, although I'm sure that neither Mike White or Jack Black even thought this at the time. But it's a very, very similar plot to The Sound of Music. And The Sound of Music's a great plot. Great plots are really, really vital, which is why I hope you're not going to ask me about Cats.
Well, it's just the opposite. It's an odd plot that actually turned out to be.
That doesn't really have a plot.
It doesn't really. I mean, to be honest, it's plotless, but it's not. It's a.
Well, what it does have.
What is it?
Well, what it does have, and I think Cats works best when this is kind of remembered, is it's the heart of T.S. Eliot. It's where we move slightly out of the cat realm and into his other work, and the song "Memory" is based on a poem in Rhapsody on a Windy Night, and it's a wonderful poem, and it's a paraphrase of a section of that. And I think that it's the heart of Eliot that sustains Cats when it's at its best, and if it kind of veers away from that, and it just then becomes something which is not particularly, to me, interesting. It's when the slightly strange spirituality that Cats has, I think, pervades the piece and pervades the performance, that I think it's at its best.
By the way, these stories you're hearing,
Amazing.
just the tip of the iceberg of what you're going to get when you pick up Unmasked, the Andrew Lloyd Webber memoir, which is out now. You've got to pick up Andrew Lloyd Webber's Unmasked, the Platinum Collection, or just download it like I'm going to do. I will say, last time you were here, I'm going to see if your answer has changed. Last time you were here, I asked you, what is your favorite song you didn't write? And you told me Some Enchanted Evening.
Well, I would stand by that. And I say that in my book. And I still think it's the greatest song for me ever written, because it's so brilliant in its simplicity, both melodically, but particularly lyrically. And you think, that's a lyric, anybody could have written that. But my goodness, it's a crafted lyric. It's really, really extraordinary. Also contains the couplet, which is the best answer for anybody who asks you, what is the secret of writing a hit musical? You just quote, "Fools give you reasons, wise men never try." And I mean, I think about it, who can explain it? Who can tell you why? Fools give you reasons, some wise men never try. Some enchanted evening you will meet a stranger. It's a superb lyric, and it doesn't actually rhyme that often either. And the tune itself is peerless.
Wow. Well, he's been here twice. Obviously, he loves us.
He has so many stories that I just want to keep talking to him and hear all the stories.
Well, I'll come back a third time if you're desperate.
Yes,
oh, absolutely. Desperation is our middle name.
I want to ask what you thought of Spider-Man on Broadway, but we'll leave that for another time.
I can tell you a lot of stories about Spider-Man on Broadway about its first night, but I'm not going to. It's interesting. Actually, I will say one thing. I went to it thinking the worst on its opening night. And I mean, I find myself sitting next to the edge, and in front of me, Bill Clinton, which was a little sort of, thinking, I'm going to have to be careful what I say here. But I actually, on the first night, when everybody says it's total disaster, I didn't think it was. I think it was just shoehorned into the wrong thing. I don't think it should have ever gone anywhere near Broadway. I mean, it would have been one of those things I'd have thought worked quite well as a totally rock show in an arena.
Right.
And not even tried to sort of it. But the trouble about a musical is once you get a production on the road and it's there, it's like a juggernaut going downhill, and you can't stop it. It's very, very difficult. It brings me back to one thing that Hal Prince said to me very, very early on in my career. He went to see this ill-fated musical I touched on earlier called Jeeves, and he wrote me a letter, and it was the consequence of that letter that led to me saying, I'm doing Evita, would you be interested in directing? But again in my book, but what he said to me stayed with me forever and ever and ever, and I think it's one of the wisest pieces of advice I was ever given in my career, which is that you can't listen to a musical if you can't look at it. What he meant is that if the production was wrong, and the design of the production was wrong, an audience is uncomfortable. They don't know why, but they're uncomfortable and they're uneasy with what they're seeing. And if you think back over the years, I mean, there have been shows where that's happened to, which have opened wrong. Say, take Chicago, which I saw in its original production. Years later, I mean, after Chicago had been long gone and buried, it comes up in the Encore series in what is essentially really a very, very highly staged concert. And it worked. It completely worked. And something was wrong about that original production. And I think Hal's right. You can have a show that just looks wrong and you just don't feel comfortable during the evening.
So that's why you say Frozen is beautiful. And
well, I
really
think Frozen is beautiful.
Yeah.
And in my case, say take Phantom of the Opera, that production, Maria Bjornsson's extraordinary design, fits so completely with what I wrote that there is one. I think it's very rare. I think for all of the ingredients to come together for a musical, which is all of the parts, it's the director, the choreographer, the design, the lighting, the performances, obviously, choreography, music, lyrics, book, story, everything, to all come together as they did for me in Phantom, or they did with Lion King, or done with Hamilton, or whatever. For it to come together to that extent is very, very rare.
Wow.
Wow.
These stories and more, please pick up Andrew Lloyd Webber's Unmasked. And of course, while you're reading it, listen to the collection.
Yep.
He has to pay off that mortgage that second mortgage from Cats.
Yeah.
We're gonna pay off Cats with this book.
It's all that money I lost on Bitcoins.
I know exactly. Oh, shit. There you have it. Thank you for coming back. Andrew
you.
Lloyd Webber, fantastic.
Thank you.